Fellas, it seems like in the UFC, every other card, there's a new big prospect on the rise, or there's just a new prospect on nearly every single card, but not all of them are unbeatable, not all of them are going to go untouched, because I've got some nightmare matchups for every prospect in the UFC. We've seen it time and time again. Some big prospects this year have had a ton of hype, and they were the massive favourite going into the fight, and then they've just not been able to perform. They've met their match, they've met their nightmare matchup, and they've ended up getting into the fraud check zone. So I'm going to be going through some nightmare matchups for the UFC's biggest prospects right now. Now, the way this is going to work is, if they are a ranked prospect and if they happen to be in the rankings, I'm going to be matchmaking them against other ranked fighters. But if these prospects aren't actually ranked, then I feel like it's a bit unfair if I put them against other ranked fighters in terms of nightmare matchups. So if they're not ranked, I'm only going to be matchmaking them against, or putting them against nightmare matchups that also aren't ranked. So we'll start off with the first prospect, which is Shara Magomedov, 14-0, 3-0 in the UFC, and seems to be a really good striker in all three of his performances he's put up so far. Now, what would be a nightmare matchup for Shara Magomedov would be someone who's obviously a high-level grappler, and just someone that won't let him bully them on the feet. Listen, we've seen time and time again in the UFC with Shara Magomedov, he struggles with grappling. In his debut against Bruno Silva, when he fought Nickal, when he fought Antonio Tricole, he struggled with grappling in all three of those fights, and none of those guys are like high-level grapplers as well. He hasn't faced a high-level grappler in the UFC so far, so I can only imagine what a high-level grappler is going to do to Shara Magomedov. So the fighter I've put him against is Bo Nickal. I think Bo Nickal's a nightmare matchup for Shara Magomedov, and that's exactly why Bo Nickal called him out on Twitter. He gets to fight a big name and he gets a free win. Bo Nickal is a nightmare matchup. He comes from a wrestling background. He's had a big wrestling background before the UFC, which is why he's got so much hype with only few fights. And even in the UFC, he's been able to display his grappling, multiple submissions. His wrestling seems to be super dominant. He has got a couple of things to work on here and there, but he's still an extremely dominant wrestler, to say that he's not ranked. So for Shara Magomedov, I think Bo Nickal's a nightmare matchup. I think Bo Nickal would easily take Shara Magomedov down. From what I've seen in Shara Magomedov's 3 fights, he doesn't look great against grapplers. You put him against one of the best unranked wrestlers in the UFC, I don't see that ending well for Shara Magomedov. I think Bo Nickal would take him down and sub him in 1 round, and if he doesn't sub him, he'd just wear him out across 3 rounds, but I'm confident he'd find the submission. So for Shara Magomedov, great striker, but if we put him against Bo Nickal, he would get squashed in that fight pretty comfortably. So that's the nightmare matchup for Shara Magomedov. Then for Bo Nickal himself, 6-0 in the UFC, but he's still a massive prospect himself. I mean, he made the main card of UFC 300 when he was only 5-0. Now, what would be a nightmare matchup for Bo Nickal would be somebody who is also a high-level grappler, especially defensively. Somebody that is dangerous everywhere the fight goes. And someone that's, more importantly, just threatening on the feet as well. Someone that's going to give him a big threat on the feet. We've seen it with Bo Nickal. Listen, he's a great grappler. He's a great high-level grappler. But how would he do when he faces someone that can defend those takedowns? When he faces someone that's going to make him work on the feet? So the nightmare matchup I've got for Bo Nickal is Gregory Rodriguez. I think in the middleweight division, Gregory Rodriguez is a nightmare matchup for Bo Nickal. And I would probably pick at this moment in time Gregory Rodriguez to beat Bo Nickal. Gregory Rodriguez has great grappling. I mean, the team that he trains at has such good jiu-jitsu on. His back is amazing as well, and he's just displayed in the UFC so far, even against his last fight against Christian Leroy Duncan. His grappling is amazing, specifically his jiu-jitsu, and then when it comes to knocking people out, this dude hits like an absolute truck. He's just an absolute machine. He's got crazy KO power, and I think if you put him against Bo Nickal, he would do enough to, keep the fight on the feet, and I think he would just walk down Bo Nickal and seriously make it a dogfight. And I just don't think Bo Nickal's tested enough yet to beat a guy like Gregory Rodriguez. Gregory Rodriguez ticks all the boxes when it comes to beating Bo Nickal. He's got good takedown defense, he's got good jiu-jitsu, and he's an absolute monster on the feet. And I think he's going to be ranked one day too. So for Bo Nickal, the nightmare matchup I think would be Gregory Rodriguez, especially after his last performance against somebody as well-rounded as Christian Leroy Duncan. He really impressed me in that fight, and I think he's Bo Nickal's biggest nightmare in the middleweight division. Now for Payton Talbott, again, massive prospect, recently got that really quick knockout at UFC 303. People are already comparing him to O'Malley. Now a nightmare matchup for Payton Talbott would be a heavy wrestler, someone that's going to bring a heavy wrestling game, somebody with good stamina, good enough to go 3 rounds fairly easily, and someone that's good enough on the feet. Not necessarily better than Payton Talbott on the feet, but somebody that's good enough to last on the feet. Now, the reason I say heavy grappler is because we saw in the Contender Series, the fights where Payton Talbott struggled the most were where he was getting grappled. The only reason he ended up winning those fights was because his opponents couldn't last a full 3 rounds. But for the first round and the second round in that fight, But Payton Talbott was getting out grappled pretty comfortably, so you put him against a high-level grappler in the UFC, I don't think it ends too well. That's why I think the nightmare matchup would be Farid Basharat. Mr. Farid Basharat himself, I think, would be a nightmare matchup for Payton Talbott. This dude has a shit ton of submissions on his record, and he's just a great grappler overall. He's got really good submission ability. His ability to take opponents to the ground has been amazing, and even in the UFC in the Contender Series so far, he's already displayed that he's a really good grappling prospect in the bantamweight division, and bantamweight is a division full of strikers as well. So Farid Basharat definitely stands out, which is why I've chosen him as a nightmare matchup for Payton Talbott. I think if he can get the ground to the fight to the floor, I think he can keep it there across 3 rounds. And on the feet, obviously, you want to favour Payton Talbot in that fight, but I think because of the grappling threat that Farid Basharat has, I think he would be a really dangerous matchup for Payton Talbot. And it's easy to go and, put Payton Talbot against another high-level striker, but we don't know how good Payton Talbot's striking is compared to these other high-level strikers. For all we know, he could be miles better, but one thing we do know is that he struggles with grappling from what we've seen in the Contender Series. So I'm going to go with Farid Basharat for Payton Talbot. Then for Joe Pyfer, even though he did face Jack Hermansson and lose, I'd say he's still a big prospect, especially after that massive win, also at UFC 303. Now, a nightmare matchup for Joe Pyfer, in my opinion, would be somebody that can match his scary power. Someone that's not going to be afraid of Joe Pyfer's power because they have the same power themselves, and also somebody that, just any decent striker. Listen, Joe Pyfer was getting worked on the feet by Jack Hermansson. Any decent technical striker, I think, would beat Joe Pyfer because, like I said, we know he hits like an absolute truck. He's being labelled as one of the hardest hitting unranked middleweights, or one of the hardest hitting middleweights in the world, regardless of if he's ranked or not. And I think he's going to be somebody that's not afraid of Joe Pyfer's power. So I think a nightmare matchup for Joe Pyfer would be Bruno Ferreira. This dude is an absolute machine. The Hulk is an absolute machine. His only losses to Ruzi Boyev, and apart from that, he's got 4 KOs in the UFC, all in the first round. His last win was extremely impressive as well. That spinning back elbow. He's just a KO artist. He's even beaten Gregory Rodriguez himself. He KO'd Chinny Phil Hawes. He's such a talented striker. He's Bruno Ferreira, and he hits like an absolute truck. And I think if it was between him and Bo Nickal on the feet, I already think he's a lot more technical than Bo Nickal. And as far as power goes, they're fairly even. They both hit extremely hard. And like I said before, Joe Pyfer was getting worked on the feet by Jack Hermansson, a grappler. You put him against Bruno Ferreira. I don't know if that ends too well for Pyfer. It could go either way. I can see both of them getting KO'd in that fight because they both hit extremely hard. But Bruno Ferreira, because he's so powerful and he's actually a technical striker, I think it'd be a really scary and a dangerous fight for Joe Pyfer, as would he be for anyone else in the division. So for Joe Pyfer, I'm going to go with Bruno Ferreira. Michael Morales, 17-0, undefeated, kind of gone under the radar when it comes to prospects, and he recently got that really good win over Neil Magny, and I think he's definitely going to be ranked, which is why I'm going to put him against a ranked fighter. But a nightmare matchup for him would be someone who offers a grappling threat from everywhere. It's going to be very hard for anyone to stand with Michael Morales unless you're one of the elite strikers, so you've got to be able to offer some sort of grappling threat to him, but also somebody who can handle elite strikers. Listen, if I'm going to say they're a nightmare matchup for Michael Morales, I must have seen them against other elite strikers in the UFC to make me think that way, because Michael Morales is such a crafty striker. He's so unique, and he's also so calm and patient as well. He takes his time, but he's just so good on the feet, he's Michael Morales. So, a nightmare matchup, I'm going to go with one of the biggest names in the welterweight division, Shavkat Rakhmonov. I think simply Shavkat would be a massive threat to him. We've seen him against elite strikers before, but the way that he handled Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, another great striker, just dominated him with grappling that entire fight until they got the submission. Same with Jeff Neal, a back and forth war where he was able to find the submission. So we've seen Shavkat tested against elite strikers before, and he's passed the test. He's undefeated as well, finished every single fighter that he's fought. So yeah, I'm going to say Shavkat Rakhmonov would be a nightmare matchup for Michael Morales, just because of the grappling threat and the fact that we've actually seen him beat elite strikers before. And I'm not saying it would go the exact same way. I'm not saying that Michael Morales is the same as those other guys, but I think Shavkat is a nightmare matchup, not only for Morales, but for most people in the division. Then we've got Mytykbek Orolbai, another big grappling prospect in the UFC, got that win over Elvis Brennan. Now, a nightmare matchup would consist of somebody who's another good wrestler and grappler, especially defensively. Somebody that's able to survive that onslaught of grappling from Mytykbek Orolbai. Someone that's actually got 3-round stamina, and I say that because Orolbai seemed to be fading in that 3rd round when he faced Elvis Brennan. So you hope it's somebody with 3-round stamina, and someone that is going to make it dangerous on the feet for Mytykbek Orolbai, and somebody that's going to make it a dogfight. Elvis Brennan tried doing that, he fell short. But we know that Mytykbek Orolbai is a relentless grappler. If he takes you to the mat, he's going to try and find the submission, and he's very good at doing that. He seems to be one of the best grappling prospects in the lightweight division. So for Mytykbek Orolbai, in my opinion, a nightmare matchup for him would be Diego Ferreira. This dude has been on a roll recently. I mean, in his last fight, absolutely destroyed Rumbetsky. But you look at this dude, he's got submission threat himself. I think defensively, he's got really good grappling, and offensively, his jiu-jitsu is really good. But more importantly, this dude has some amazing striking. Sent Michael Johnson to the Shadow Realm, and his last fight against Rumbetsky, like I said, absolutely dominated him. And he seems to be one of the better unranked fighters in the lightweight division as well, does Diego Ferreira. And he's only really lost to the top guys like Dariush and Poirier. So I think Diego Ferreira would be a nightmare matchup for Orolbai. I think he'd be able to survive that onslaught of grappling from Orolbai, and I think on the feet he would have a lot to offer to Mytykbek Orolbai. I think he'd be able to tag him a lot. I think he'd be able to offer that, KO threat to him. So for Mytykbek Orolbai, I think Diego Ferreira would be a nightmare matchup for him in the UFC, just because of what he can do in the UFC and the fact that he's got good stamina, as he showed in his last fight, and obviously his grappling as well. Carlos Prates just recently got that really good win at UFC 305 in the last pay-per-view, and he's one of the best striking prospects right now in the welterweight division. So a nightmare matchup would consist of somebody that can hold their own on the feet. Again, not someone that's necessarily better than Carlos Prates on the feet, because that's going to be very, very hard to find, but somebody that can hold their own on the feet, and also someone who is well-rounded, just a well-rounded fighter who's going to be applying heavy grappling pressure. Again, when you're going against a striker as good as Carlos Prates, your best opportunity is mixing it up with the grappling and taking it to the mat, because we've seen in his last fight against Li Jingliang, he's super dangerous on the feet. He comes from that Fighting Nerds gym, and he's just such a big threat on the feet. He just walks forward very calmly, but he just pieces people apart until he gets the finish. So for Carlos Prates, in my opinion, a nightmare matchup would be Rinat Fakhretdinov. It was between Rinat and Nicholas Daly, but I've gone with Rinat Fakhretdinov. I think Rinat Fakhretdinov ticks all the boxes in a guy that would be dangerous for Carlos Prates. He's a good striker. I'm not saying he's a better striker, but he's shown in multiple of his fights. He's a good striker. He can strike. His kickboxing is at a decent level, and he's got a very, very good grappling pace. His submission game is amazing. Defensively, he's a good grappler, but most importantly, he would be pushing a pace on Carlos Prates for 3 rounds straight, mixing it up well with the striking and the grappling. He's not one-dimensional. He's well-rounded, and I think he would mix it up against Carlos Prates, and I think he would be a nightmare matchup against Carlos Prates. Again, I'm not saying he's a better striker, but I think he would mix it up very effectively. And then we've got Gene Silva, another fellow Fighting Nerds fighter. Now, here's the thing about Gene Silva. A nightmare matchup. The thing is about Gene Silva, though, is he is the nightmare. Listen, I'm not saying there's nobody in the UFC that can't beat Gene Silva. I'm not saying that can beat Gene Silva. I'm not saying that he's completely untouchable or he's the best fighter in the 145 or 155, whatever division he wants to fight at. But it's very hard to think of a nightmare matchup. He ticks all the boxes. He can fight in a dogfight. He's crafty. He's dangerous. He's powerful. He's got wrestling. He ticks all the boxes. So unless this dude gets ranked, I don't think there's any major threats to Gene Silva in the unranked area of the 145 division, which I assume is going to be staying at. So as of right now, in the unranked 145 division, Gene Silva, he's the nightmare. He is the nightmare in that division, so I've literally got to skip Gene Silva because he just ticks all the boxes. Then we've got Lerone Murphy, another one of these fighters that goes under the radar, 14-0, undefeated, got that win over Edson Barboza last year. Now, a nightmare matchup for Lerone Murphy would have to be someone that's got good takedown defense, someone that can, defend the grappling from Lerone Murphy, and also someone that's a better striker than him. We've seen time and time again Lerone Murphy. He came from a grappling background. In his early UFC career, he liked to mix it up with the grappling a lot. He's a really, really good grappler. His submission game and his ground and pound is good as well. But he also showed in his last fight against Edson Barboza, his striking seems to be a lot better as well. He's got this pace that he can push for 5 rounds. He's tough as nails. He's got really good boxing as well, does Lerone Murphy. And he seems to be becoming a lot more well-rounded. So, a nightmare matchup. Listen, this may seem unfair, but I'm simply just going to go with Alexander Volkanovski because he's ranked, and if we're talking about unranked nightmares, Volkanovski's that guy. I mean, we've seen him face grapplers before at Islam Makhachev, and his takedown defense was on point. He's an amazing wrestler, one of the best wrestlers in the 145 division is Alexander Volkanovski, and he's one of the best strikers as well. Listen, he might have been KO'd in his last 2 fights, but don't make no mistake, he's still one of the most technical and still one of the most high-level strikers in that division, which is why he's one of the greatest in that division as well. So, for Lerone Murphy, it might seem a bit unfair that I'm putting him against someone like this, but Alexander Volkanovski is a nightmare matchup. He'd be able to survive the grappling from Lerone Murphy with no stress, and he would just absolutely pick Lerone Murphy apart on the feet. Listen, Like I said, Murphy's improved his striking a lot, as he showed against Edson Barboza, but he's still miles ahead of Alexander Volkanovski. So, Volkanovski, in my opinion, is a nightmare matchup for Lerone Murphy. But in that same division, we have Joanderson Brito, a guy that got that really good one at UFC 301 against Jack Shaw. Joanderson Brito is probably one of the best unranked featherweights right now. Now, for the Joanderson Brito, a nightmare matchup would consist of somebody who is just as quick as him on the feet. He's super fast on the feet, he's Joanderson Brito. His leg kicks, his boxing, he's super quick. So it would have to be someone who's just as quick on the feet. Someone who's a grappler, because we saw in that fight with Jonathan Pierce, he struggles with grapplers. And somebody who can make it a dogfight. Somebody who's not afraid to make it into a dogfight and not afraid to go into deep waters to get the win over Joanderson Brito. Listen, like I said, he's super fast. He's super dangerous on the feet, Joanderson Brito. And I think he picks apart most unranked featherweights on the feet. But we saw in that fight with Jonathan Pierce, even though he was able to get the submission, for the majority of that fight against Jonathan Pierce, he was struggling, he was on his back, and he was getting dominated in the grappling department by Jonathan Pierce. So for Joanderson Brito, a nightmare matchup in my opinion would be Felipe Lima, the dude who debuted in his UFC in his last fight against Mohamed Naimov, got the submission. I think Felipe Lima's a nightmare matchup. He was an Octagon champion, a champion in a different organization, came over to the UFC, and he's super fast on the feet, is Felipe Lima. In that first round against Mohamed Naimov, he was rapid, he nearly finished him in that first round. Super quick on the feet, another young, fresh fighter for Joanderson Brito, and he's also got the grappling. He wasn't the favourite when it came to grappling when he was facing Mohamed Naimov. We all thought Mohamed Naimov was going to be pushing a grappling pace in that fight. Felipe Lima ends up submitting him. Felipe Lima's got really good jiu-jitsu and he seems to be really well-rounded. So if we're talking about unranked fighters that would be a nightmare matchup for Joanderson Brito, I've got to go with Felipe Lima. He seems to be well-rounded, he's quick, he's got good submission game, and I think he would pose a lot of threats to a guy as good as Joanderson Brito. Another young guy who's on his come-up as well, and I'm sure he's going to be getting a big fight soon after that win over Naimov. So for Joanderson Brito, I'm going to go with Felipe Lima. Then we've got Chase Hooper. Listen, this guy was kind of mocked in his early UFC career, but in his last fight, he looked really dominant with his grappling. Now, a nightmare matchup for Chase Hooper would consist of somebody that's, well, first of all, any threat on the feet. Chase Hooper's really slow on the feet, so anybody that's a threat on the feet, and just anyone with good wrestling defense and submission threat, anyone that can survive the grappling of Chase Hooper, somebody with good takedown defense, somebody with good jiu-jitsu defense, somebody that can survive the grappling of Chase Hooper. We saw in multiple of his fights now, specifically that fight with Steve Garcia, he's really slow on the feet and he's just not a good striker. It doesn't take an elite boxer to beat Chase Hooper. Just anybody with decent hands and decent speed can probably tag apart Chase Hooper on the feet. But we also know he's a really good grappler. Like I said, in his last fight against Borshev, he absolutely dominated Borshev with his grappling. He looked like one of the best grapplers in the lightweight division in that one fight. Obviously, I'm not calling him one of the best grapplers in the lightweight division, but his grappling in that fight was extremely dominant, and he just put on a great display of grappling. So, a nightmare matchup for Chase Hooper, in my opinion, would be Elvis Brenner. An absolute dog in the lightweight division. Elvis Brenner is tough as nails, and he's only been facing the toughest guys like Yoel Alvarez and like Mytykbek Orolbai. Elvis Brenner, I think, would be a nightmare matchup for Chase Hooper. He is a massive threat on the feet. He's a KO artist. He's very, very dangerous on the feet. And if he clocks you with a good shot, it could be lights out. And I think you put him against somebody as slow as Chase Hooper, and I think he would find that knockout shot early on. And as far as grappling goes, his grappling defense is amazing. He showed that when he faced a submission artist in Yoel Alvarez and Mytykbek Orolbai. He was able to survive those. Well, he couldn't survive against Alvarez, but that wasn't because of grappling. And he trains at Shooter Box with some of the best grapplers. I think he'll be able to survive the grappling, and I genuinely think Elvis Brenner would put Chase Hooper's lights out on the feet within a round. So for Chase Hooper, a nightmare matchup for this dude would be somebody like Elvis Brenner, a guy that can make it a dogfight, a guy with great grappling, but more importantly, a guy that's an absolute monster on the feet. So I'm going to go with Elvis Brenner for Chase Hooper. Then the guy that just recently beat Elvis Brenner, Yoel Alvarez, in my opinion, the best unranked lightweight in the world right now. 21-3, amazing submission artist, and just got that win over Brenner. Now, a nightmare matchup for Yoel Alvarez would consist of somebody that is a heavy wrestler and somebody that has good submission defense. Now, we know that Yoel Alvarez has some of the best jiu-jitsu in the lightweight division. His jiu-jitsu game is so good. He is a massive threat when it comes to submissions, and his ability to just latch up submissions from anywhere is amazing. But we saw in that fight with Arman Tsarukyan absolutely dominated Yoel Alvarez. He made it look not even close. He wasn't afraid of the submissions, and he just dominated him with some good old-fashioned wrestling. And that is exactly what I think the blueprint is to beating Yoel Alvarez, a high-level wrestler. So I'm going to bring up somebody who's already been on this list, and I'm going to say that Mytykbek Orolbai would be a nightmare matchup for Yoel Alvarez. Mytykbek Orolbai, he fought Elvis Brenner as well, and he was actually able to push a grappling pace on Elvis Brenner, unlike Yoel Alvarez. Like I said, he's not a flawless fighter, he's Mytykbek Orolbai, but he's a relentless grappler. If he takes it to the mat, it's going to be very difficult to get him off of you. He's got good submission game himself, both offensively and defensively, and I think he would out-wrestle Yoel Alvarez. I'm not saying he'd get the submission or anything like that, because Alvarez, like I said, he's got really good submission game, but I think he would push a grappling threat and a grappling pace on Yoel Alvarez for 3 rounds straight, as long as he can survive those later rounds with his dodgy stamina. And I think that Mytykbek Orolbai would be a nightmare matchup for somebody as good as Yoel Alvarez. So for Alvarez, I'm going to say he's a relentless grappler like Mytykbek Orolbai. Then for Paddy Pimblett, kind of weird seeing this dude as a prospect, because everyone's been mocking him, but he kind of is a prospect after that win over Bobby Green, and he's now ranked. A nightmare matchup for Paddy Pimblett would simply be somebody that he's going to force him into a war. He's going to force him into a dogfight, and somebody that's going to crack that chin of Paddy Pimblett. We've seen multiple times in his UFC debut, in his fight with Jared Gordon, he leaves his chin up high. He's tried tucking it a lot more recently, but just anyone that's going to force him into a war and crack that chin and force him into a dogfight would be difficult for Paddy Pimblett. You could honestly pick multiple fighters in the lightweight division, but I'm going to go with Justin Gaethje. I think Justin Gaethje would be a nightmare matchup for Paddy Pimblett. Listen, Gaethje would do unspeakable things to Pimblett. An absolute threat on the feet. A guy who knocks out your favourite fighters. A guy who is just an absolute monster everywhere on the feet. He doesn't get tired. He just keeps walking forward, throwing shots. One of the most powerful dudes in the 155 division. Great boxer. Seems to be a lot more focused with his work with Trevor Whitman recently as well. Not as chaotic. Well-rounded. Justin Gaethje, listen, Paddy Pimblett, I think he could have a bright future in the flyweight, in the lightweight division if he keeps this up. But if he was ever to face somebody like Justin Gaethje, it wouldn't be a good fight night for Paddy Pimblett. He would get cracked on his chin early on. He would get finished in that first round, and he would get brutally out. I think Justin Gaethje would send Paddy Pimblett to the shadow realm brutally and leave him out cold. Pimblett, he's got a good route to the title if he faces somebody like maybe Renato Moicano, and there may be somebody like Beneil Dariush, but if he's ever matched up against somebody like Chandler or Gaethje, it's lights out for Paddy Pimblett. These guys are way too good for him, and they're just too high level for Paddy Pimblett, so I'm going to go with Justin Gaethje for Pimblett. Then we've got Carlos Ulberg. Some people think he's the future of the light heavyweight division. Now, for Carlos Ulberg, now, a nightmare matchup would be anyone who's got any good fight IQ, somebody that's well-rounded, they can strike and they can grapple, and somebody that's dangerous on the feet, specifically in those later rounds when Carlos Ulberg is tired. We've seen in the UFC that when Carlos Ulberg gets taken into deep waters in those later rounds, he struggles. He becomes very sloppy, he becomes unorthodox, he leaves himself open, and he's very vulnerable in those later rounds, is Carlos Ulberg. He got KO'd in the third round because of how vulnerable he was in those later rounds. But with that being said, he's really dangerous in that first round, and he kind of capitalizes on these guys with low fight IQ, like in his last fight against Alonzo Menifield. So for Carlos Ulberg, I think a nightmare matchup, and he's ranked as well, so I've got to include a ranked fighter, would be Magomed Ankalaev. I think Ankalaev ticks all the boxes. We've seen him in that last round against Jan Blachowicz. He did a really good last round against Jan Blachowicz, which shows that he got the stamina to go 5 rounds. Never mind 3 rounds, but 5 rounds. And he's got dangerous hands as well. He saw in that fight with Johnny Walker, he's got very dangerous hands. He's one of the best wrestlers. He's well-rounded. He would be a nightmare matchup for Carlos Ulberg. I think he's got the ability to take it into those later rounds when Ulberg might struggle. I think he's got the ability to mix it up with the grappling, and I think he's just got the ability to offer some threat on the feet to Carlos Ulberg in those later rounds with Magomedov's sharp striking. So for Carlos Ulberg, really good fighter, really well-rounded, has a promising future in the light heavyweight division, but somebody like Ankalaev, in my opinion, will be a nightmare matchup. And then we've got Roman Kopylov. Really high-level striker, one of the best unranked strikers in the middleweight division. For Roman Kopylov, a nightmare matchup would consist of somebody that is a heavy grappler and just someone that can blend the striking in with the grappling. I think Anthony Hernandez showed us the blueprint to beat in Roman Kopylov. It's just a high-level grappler, somebody that can take him down and find a submission. It's not just Anthony Hernandez as well. Roman Kopylov doesn't do well against other high-level grapplers who can blend in the striking with the grappling, take it to the mat, and rough him up on the ground or find the submission. So for Roman Kopylov, I think a nightmare matchup in the unranked area of the middleweight division would be Ikram Aliskerov. Ikram Aliskerov, in my opinion, ticks those boxes. He does a really good job at blending the striking in with the grappling. Listen, we saw in his early fights in the UFC, especially with Wally Alvarez, he's a big threat on the feet. He's very dangerous on the feet. He's very, very powerful on the feet, and he's a big threat also on the ground. His main game plan is to take you to the ground and find the submission. If Ikram Aliskerov wants to take Roman Kopylov to the ground, he's going to do that comfortably. And I know people are going to be bringing up the fact that Ikram Aliskerov lost to Whittaker. Listen, Kopylov and Whittaker are completely different strikers. Whittaker has a very dangerous blitz, which worked against Ikram Aliskerov, whereas Kopylov likes picking you apart and timing that perfect shot, which I just don't think Ikram Aliskerov Kopylov would allow him to do so. For Roman Kopylov, a nightmare matchup in my opinion would be Ikram Aliskerov, but those are my nightmare matchups for prospects in the UFC. Fighters who I think would be the biggest test for them in the UFC, whether they're ranked or unranked. So let me know your thoughts on this list and if I should have included any more prospects and just your overall thoughts on the fighters that I've chosen. But thank you for watching.